There is a grief that has no funeral, no announcement, no one who brings flowers, no socially acceptable window of time in which you are permitted to fall apart. It is the grief of something that never existed. A life you imagined so completely that losing it feels exactly like losing something real. A relationship you needed and never had. A version of yourself that almost was and then wasn't. A childhood that should have felt like safety and didn't. A future you built in such careful detail that when it dissolved, you were left standing in the wreckage of something no one else could see. And because no one could see it, no one knew to ask how you were doing. No one knew there was something to mourn. So you did what you always do. You moved on. You kept going. You told yourself it was irrational, grieving something you never had. You told yourself to be grateful for what was real. And underneath all of that reasonable instruction, the grief remained. Patient, unnamed, entirely unprocessed, because you were never given permission to call it what it was. In the next 15 minutes, I am going to give you that permission. I am going to give you the name for what you have been carrying, and I am going to show you precisely why this particular grief is so disorienting, why it arrives without warning, why it has no clear timeline, and why the standard stages of grief were never designed to hold it. By the end of this, you will understand what disenfranchised grief actually is. You will understand the specific psychological mechanism by which imagined things become as real to the brain as experienced ones. You will understand why the most imaginative, most emotionally complex people are the most vulnerable to this particular kind of loss. And you will have 3 ways of beginning to mourn something that the world has no ritual for, not to get over it, to finally actually move through it. You know the feeling. It arrives without warning, usually in an ordinary moment. You are watching someone else's family at a restaurant. You are at a friend's wedding. You are scrolling through photographs of a life that looks exactly like the one you once believed was coming. And something drops. Not dramatically, not with tears necessarily, just a quiet internal dropping, like a stone through still water. And you think, why does this hurt? Nothing happened to me. I didn't lose anything. What is wrong with me? But here is what is actually true. You did lose something. You lost the life you believed was yours. The relationship that was going to be different. The parent who was going to show up. The version of yourself who was going to feel whole once the right circumstances arrived. These were not fantasies. They were blueprints. You built them with the full force of your hope and your need and your imagination. You furnished them. You populated them with people and light and a specific quality of safety. You rehearsed them. You returned to them again and again, the way you return to a house you love. And then, at some point, in some way, you understood they were never going to exist. The parent was not going to change. The relationship was not going to become what you needed. The version of you that felt whole was not waiting around the corner. And that understanding, that quiet, devastating understanding, was a loss. A real loss, with no name and no witness, and nowhere to put the grief. The term is disenfranchised grief. It was first named by the grief researcher Kenneth Doka to describe mourning that occurs without social recognition, without the cultural rituals that normally contain and validate loss. the grief that exists outside the socially approved categories. A relationship that was never formalized. A future that never materialized. A self that never got to develop. A childhood that was present in body, but absent in the ways that mattered most. Doka's central insight was this: grief does not require a death. It requires only the loss of something that mattered, and the absence of social recognition does not reduce the grief. It amplifies it, because unwitnessed grief has nowhere to discharge. It cannot move through the normal channels, the ritual, the gathering, the socially sanctioned period of mourning. So it accumulates. In the body, in the background, surfacing in ordinary moments with no apparent trigger. Now, here is where neuroscience adds a layer that changes everything. The brain does not cleanly distinguish between real experience and vividly imagined experience. When you imagine a future in sufficient detail, when you rehearse it with enough emotional investment, the same neural pathways activate as when you actually experience the thing. The prefrontal cortex constructs a model. The limbic system assigns emotional weight. The memory systems begin to encode it as something known, familiar, expected. This is why the loss of an imagined future can produce genuine grief symptoms. Not metaphorical grief, neurological grief. The brain processing the absence of something it had already begun to treat as real. There is a concept in psychology called the imagined self, the version of you that exists in the future of your own mental model. Psychologists have found that our attachment to the imagined self is as emotionally significant as our attachment to the actual self. When the imagined self becomes unreachable, when the circumstances that would have allowed that version of you to exist are confirmed as permanently gone, the loss is experienced as a kind of death. Not metaphorically, functionally. The brain registers the permanent absence of something it had been anticipating and preparing for, and it mourns it, whether you give it permission or not. There is one more dimension, the grief of the childhood that should have been. This is perhaps the most unprocessed grief of all, because we are taught very firmly that children who were fed and sheltered and not visibly abused have nothing to grieve. That the absence of safety, attunement, emotional presence, the absence of being truly seen and held, does not constitute a loss. That what was missing does not count the way what was taken does. But the research tells a different story. The most significant grief in adult psychology is often not the loss of what was had and taken. It is the loss of what was needed and never given. The parent who was physically present and emotionally elsewhere. The childhood that looked fine from the outside and felt like holding your breath from the inside. The version of yourself that might have developed in a different environment. Freer, less defended, less afraid. That grief is real, it is old, and for most people, it has never once been named. I want to tell you about a man named James. James is 44. He would describe his childhood as fine. He says this word carefully. Fine. As in, no obvious damage, no dramatic event. A house with food and structure, and parents who stayed. Fine. But James has a recurring experience that he has never told anyone about. He sees fathers with their children at a park, at a school event, what it's in a film, and something in him goes very quiet and very heavy for reasons he cannot explain. It is not jealousy. He knows the difference. It is something older and less specific than jealousy. Something that feels like standing outside a warm window, looking in at a light you never quite got to sit beside. His father was present. James says this clearly. He was present. He came to things. He did the required activities. But he was not. James struggles here. He was not there. Not in the way James needed. Not curious about him. Not interested in what James thought or felt or imagined. Not the kind of present that makes a child feel real. James spent years, from about age 7 to about age 30, believing that the relationship he needed with his father was still possible. That the right conversation, the right moment, and the right version of James would one day unlock something in his father that had always been there, waiting. He rehearsed versions of that conversation for decades. In the car, before sleep, in the particular silence of long flights. When his father died, the grief was enormous, but it was not the grief his family expected. They mourned the man who had been there. James mourned the man who never was, the father who was curious about him, the relationship that was always one conversation away, the version of himself that would have existed if that conversation had ever happened. He stood at the funeral grieving something no one else in the room could see, something that had never existed, and was now, officially, never going to. How do you grieve something that never existed? How do you mourn a future that dissolved, a self that never got to develop, a relationship that was always one moment away from becoming what you needed? You do it in 3 stages, not quickly, not cleanly, but honestly. Step 1, grant it the status of real loss. This is the step that everything else depends on. You have to stop telling yourself that this grief is irrational, that you have no right to it, that other people have it worse, that you should be grateful for what was real. All of those things may be true, and none of them dissolve the grief. The brain does not respond to comparative suffering. It responds to acknowledged loss. So the first act is simply this. Say it. To yourself, in writing, in the dark, wherever you need to. I am grieving something that never existed. I am mourning the parent I needed and did not have. I am mourning the version of myself that would have developed in different soil. I am mourning the future I built in my mind and watched become impossible. This is a real loss. It deserves to be treated as one. The moment you grant it that status, something in the body begins to soften. Not because the grief disappears, because it finally has somewhere to land. Step 2. Find the specific shape of what you lost. Grief is not one thing, it is many specific things. And disenfranchised grief is particularly hard to process because it tends to exist as a vague ache rather than a precise loss. The work of this step is to make it precise. Not the relationship in general, the specific version of the relationship you needed. What did it look like? What did it feel like to be in it? What did it give you that nothing else did? Not the childhood in general, the specific quality of safety you needed and didn't have, the specific version of yourself that you believe would have developed if the conditions had been different. Write it down, in as much detail as you can bear, not to torture yourself, to give the grief a clear object, because grief that has a clear object can be moved through. Grief that remains formless circles indefinitely. The specificity is the path. Step 3. Mourn it with the ritual. It deserves. Every culture that has ever existed has understood something that modern psychology is only recently formalizing. Grief requires ritual, not therapy, not analysis. Ritual, a deliberate, conscious act that marks the loss as real and the mourning as intentional. For disenfranchised grief, grief with no funeral, you create the ritual yourself. You write a letter to the version of yourself that never got to exist. Write it in full. Tell them what you imagined for them, what they deserved, what you are sorry they never had. Write a letter to the parent or the relationship or the future, not to send, not to resolve, but to witness. Light a candle. Take a walk to a specific place. Sit beside water. Do something deliberate and embodied that says to your nervous system, this was real. This mattered. I am marking it. The ritual does not end the grief. It begins to move it. From the place where unnamed things live, underground, pressurized, formless, into the place where acknowledged things rest. That movement, that single shift, is everything. You are not grieving nothing. I want to say that with every possible clarity. The life you imagined was real. The version of yourself you hoped to become, real. The relationship you needed and rehearsed and waited for, real. Real in the way that anything is real that is built inside a human mind with full emotional investment. Real in the way that the brain encodes it. Real in the way that the body grieves its absence. The fact that it never materialized does not retroactively empty it of weight. It just means the loss had no socially recognized form, and a grief without form is not a smaller grief. It is a harder one, because you have been carrying it without any of the tools that the world provides for loss it understands. No ritual, no witness, no permission, no timeline at the end of which you are allowed to have moved through it. Just the quiet, persistent weight of something unmourned. That ends now. Not because you say a few words or read a script or follow 3 steps, but because you now know what you are carrying. And knowing, always, always, is where the movement begins. There is a version of you that never got to exist. Take a moment with that sentence, not with self-pity, with honesty. A version of you that would have been less defended, less afraid, less practiced at surviving, and more practiced at living. A version raised in conditions that met what you needed, that saw you clearly, that made you feel like your presence was a gift and not a burden. That version did not get to exist, and you have been carrying the grief of that for longer than you probably know. Dressed in other clothes, named as other things. The anxiety that has no source, the longing that has no object, the sense of incompleteness that follows you into rooms where everything should be enough. That is the grief of the self that never was, and it is allowed to exist, here, in this conversation, for as long as it needs to. You do not have to resolve it today. You do not have to write the letter today, or find the ritual today, or feel lighter by the time this ends. You only have to do one thing. Stop telling yourself it isn't real, because it is. It always was. Next time, we are going to talk about what happens to the people who spent so long grieving the parent they needed, that they began, without realizing it, to look for that parent in every relationship they entered. The pattern underneath the pattern. The thing that drives the choices long after the original wound has been buried under decades of ordinary life. If this reached something in you today, let it. You don't need to explain it to anyone. You don't need to justify it. Just let it be true. That is the beginning. That is always the beginning.